The roots of the United Nations can be traced back to after World War I. Its predecessor, the League of Nations, was a protective agency built on using collective security to prevent conflicts and wars. The first mention of this type of community can be found in Immanuel Kant's Perpetual Peace, a philosophical sketch written in 1795. The idea for the actual league can be traced to British Foreign Secretary Edward Grey, which was then adopted by President Woodrow Wilson, who made it the crux of his 14 points. Ironically, the United States opted out of joining the League of Nations, and this is thought of as one of the reasons that the League of Nations was ultimately unable to prevent World War II. Fast forward 20 years, World War II was raging across Europe. Hitler had taken over half the continent, and by now, the Allies were desperate for help. Enter Franklin Delano Roosevelt. As of 1942, FDR had been the President of the United States for a whopping 9 years. He was ready to fight. President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill of the United Kingdom put their heads together to fight the juggernaut of the Nazi regime. They met from August 9th to 12th, 1941, to discuss problems and solutions in the war. The result of their conferences became the Atlantic Charter and was issued on August 14th, 1941. The charter was finally approved by 26 nations on January 1st, 1942, when representatives from all the nations signed the Declaration of the United Nations. By signing the Declaration, the Allies pledged themselves to the principles of the Atlantic Charter and kickstarted the long, twisting journey to world peace. Most of this journey was undertaken by Britain, the United States of America, and the Soviet Union, collectively known as the Big Three. The first meeting was at an estate in Washington, D.C., known as Dumbarton Oaks. The Dumbarton Oaks Conference took place from August 21st to October 7th of 1944. Dumbarton Oaks can be regarded as possibly the most important of all of the conferences. Charles E. Bolin, a diplomat who represented the United States of America, commented about the conference, quote, "Dumbarton Oaks settled all but two issues regarding the organization of the United Nations: the voting procedure in the Security Council and the Soviet pressure for the admission of all 16 of the Soviet republics to the General Assembly. It took the conference at Yalta, plus further negotiations with Moscow, before the issues were solved." Dumbarton Oaks had completed its job perfectly. It set a course for the United Nations. This course was towards the founding of a worldwide organization that would keep the citizens of the world safe. They also were able to narrow down the focus of the UN. The work of the delegates showed that the people of the world didn't want much from the UN, as long as it would keep them safe from the catastrophic conflicts that had ridden the world for so long. These ideas were the least controversial at the conference, and it is not surprising, as a platform on which countries can come together as brothers for peacekeeping is something that is wished by everyone present. These ideals shaped Dumbarton Oaks and helped form a solid foundation for the delegates to work efficiently from in future conferences. The next meeting between the delegates was known as the Yalta Conference or the Crimean Conference. Delegations from the USSR, USA, and UK came to the meeting held from February 4th to February 11th of 1945. Yet again, keeping the peace between countries that at the time were still suspicious of each other was the forefront of the conversations. Most of the work done at Yalta was towards the rebuilding of Europe, but unlike his European counterparts, FDR was aiming to convince Stalin to aid the states in their ongoing war against Japan and continue their efforts to create the United Nations. FDR was successful as he got Stalin to commit to joining the new world government. Sadly, he wouldn't live to see the establishment of the United Nations, for he died a mere 6 weeks after the adjourning of the Yalta Conference. The final stop on the road to the creation of the United Nations took place in San Francisco, the United Nations Conference on International Organization Proceedings, colloquially known as the San Francisco Conference. Delegates from 50 nations who had pledged themselves against the Axis came as a result of the Big Three and China's invitations, and from the 25th of April to the 26th of June 1945, over 3,500 delegates and staff put their heads together to form the new world government. Since the San Francisco Conference was the final conference that contributed to the establishment of the United Nations. It was by far the most extensive and renowned of all the conferences. The main purpose of the San Francisco Conference was to determine the purpose and structure of the United Nations. The work undertaken by the members of the separate delegations was aimed towards the drafting of a charter for the United Nations. Somewhat unsurprisingly, the conference was not without its scruples. One of the most controversial topics at the conference was the Security Council and its rights. Smaller nations didn't want the large nations to have too much power, but they ultimately failed, and the largest countries got permanent seats on the Security Council. However, the large nations weren't too cold-hearted, and thus the United Nations was given a job as a humanitarian organization as well. We can see what the small countries envision, as the United Nations is the largest humanitarian organization ever, and the delegates knew the impacts of their work. Lord Halifax, British delegate to the San Francisco Conference, said, "The issue upon which we are about to vote is as important as we shall ever vote in our lifetime." On June 26th, all the nations present signed the Charter of the United Nations. However, their work was not complete. Many nations had to approve the charter. And finally, on October 24th, 1945, the United Nations was born. The United Nations has gained worldwide recognition for its ability to help those in need through humanitarian organizations, but this job of the UN is just the tip of a massive iceberg. The formation of the United Nations was a direct result of ongoing or possible conflicts between major powers. Delegations wished to prevent these conflicts, and thus broke the barriers between their nations to keep the citizens of the world safe. Dr. Adam Chapnick of the Canada Forces College and the Royal Military Academy of Canada says, "If you consider the establishment of the UN to have begun well before the San Francisco Conference of 1945, then it is clear to me that the planners, primarily the Americans and the British, sought to create a new world organization to succeed where the old League of Nations had failed, preventing world war. Most of the material in the charter that refers to the more humanitarian elements of the organization were added at San Francisco to make the organization more palatable to the smaller powers." The United Nations was founded in the aftermath of utter destruction on part of the large countries. They knew that they now had the power to destroy civilization as they knew it, and thus broke the barriers keeping them apart for centuries so that they could protect the children of the future. The foundation of the United Nations was created by large countries, so they focused on the big picture of keeping the people around the world safe. However, much of the destruction they strove to prevent was done to smaller countries who didn't have the infrastructure to rebuild. These small countries weren't too concerned about the big picture, as they needed aid from the large powers to rebuild their nations. Though these humanitarian aspects of the organization are important to the world today, we must remember that these jobs were not the intention. We must remember the work of the United Nations behind the scenes that keeps us safe from harm. One such job that has flown under the radar is when the United Nations broke barriers between Central Asian countries so they could responsibly share their water supply. In former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon's report, he said, "For example, the United Nations Regional Center for Preventive Diplomacy for Central Asia plays an important mediation role in promoting the responsible sharing and management of the region's water supply among the 5 Central Asian states. In most cases, the UNEP provides baseline information to assist negotiations, but on occasion has mediated with the consent of parties." The United Nations successfully mitigated this crisis, preventing the possible deaths of thousands of people. Because of its barrier-breaking prowess, the United Nations is able to foster a positive global community for now and for the future. The UN is the paragon of breaking barriers. It brought together people of different ideologies at a time where the air was electric with mistrust, and as a result, has saved the lives of millions of people by breaking the barriers that kept them apart in the past so they could come together in the present and solve the problems of the future.